Hello friends, my name is Ben Rakowski. I'm a cinematographer here in Brooklyn. We are at Adorama Rental Company in Greenwood, and today we are testing out the DZOFilm Vespid 2s. So this is the second series of Vespid lenses from DZO. They are a mid-range lens when it comes to price point. They are full frame primes. Each one of them opens up to a 1.9. They have a nice uniform shape, so in terms of using accessories, they should be pretty nicely matched. But we're gonna be running them through a series of tests today, and I'm gonna save my opinions about the lenses till the very end. I'm really gonna be talking about them from an objective standpoint, but we're gonna be examining flaring, we're gonna be looking at bokeh, we're gonna be looking at their geometric distortion, vignetting, resolution and contrast, close focus and breathing, color cast, and then finally we're going to take them outside and look at how they render the human face. And as we go, I'll let you know what I'm observing with these lenses, and I'll tell you sort of about what we're looking for with each one of these tests. First test that we're going to do is flaring. It's going to inform us about how any flares are going to look with this camera, whether it's the sun, a flashlight. We're going to test out the 18, the 35, and the 85 for this flare test. First thing is veiling or glare. I am noticing a little bit of veiling, but only when the hotspot is directly pointed into the lens. So that's really nice. As you can see down here, it gets a little bit less contrasty when we're getting hit directly. Next thing that I'm looking for is the actual spot, which is circular. It's really beautiful. It's really lovely. We're getting a little bit of ghost flaring, a reflection of the actual flashlight. A little bit of ghost flaring, not too much. I'm seeing no eyelash flaring, and what's really nice about this is we are getting a nice ring flare. So that is that warm outer flare that we see around the flashlight. For a modern sort of mid-range price point lens to have those ring flares is really lovely. Generally, the longer the focal length gets, the less veiling you're gonna get, and I'm seeing no veiling here. I'm seeing no area where it gets sort of milky when we're hit directly by the lens. I'm noticing a lot more ghosting. So if you notice, as Jeff starts to hit the lens, we get our ghost appearing on the opposite side, and it's sort of staying with us the entire time. But in general, ghost flares are not something that I'm against. We get, again, a really warm, rich center spot, and we get a really nice orange ring again. It's sort of a smaller ring than on the 18 mil, but I am still getting that ring flare, which is really nice. The only thing that I think might be problematic is if you are trying to get rid of the ghost flare. The ghost flare is definitely more apparent on the 35 than it was on the 18. But otherwise, it's a really lovely and controllable flare. What I'm noticing with this 85 mil, the flare is very similar to the 35. Very little glare or veiling, so we're not getting any sort of loss in contrast as we're getting hit by the flare. Even when Jeff is directly hitting down the barrel of the lens, I'm not noticing any veiling. Noticing a little bit of ghost flaring, actually less than with the 35. And in terms of the actual spot flare, again, it's really warm, it's really lovely. I'd say across the board so far with these lenses, the flares are really nice and they're very uniform. So we're doing our bokeh test, completely open on our aperture so that we get as much bokeh as possible. We're going to take a look at this both with the mid-ground in focus. Jeff is in focus right now. I'm going to pull to close focus so we get as much bokeh as possible in our background, and then I'm going to pull to infinity so we get as much bokeh as possible in the foreground. So because these are spherical lenses, you'd expect that these are going to have a pretty circular, concentric circle bokeh. The other thing that we would notice with bokeh is whether or not the blur highlights are either overcorrected or undercorrected. That's the spherical aberration of the lens. So if it's overcorrected, what you're gonna see is extra outline on the outside of the concentric circles. If it was undercorrected, we'd sort of see a more out of focus, blurry transition to the bokeh. And if it's corrected sort of right in the middle, you're not going to see highlight blur going to the overcorrected side or the undercorrected side. And in terms of what I'm seeing with this lens right off the bat is that it looks like it's slightly overcorrected. I am seeing a slight border on there, but it's pretty minimal. I would say that these have a pretty straight down the middle correction in terms of the spherical aberration. We are open to a 1.9. First off the bat, shape of the bokeh. It is still sort of perfectly circular at the center of the lens, but what you'll notice if you're looking on the sides is that suddenly we're not getting these perfect concentric circles anymore. We get these sort of lemon-shaped bokehs on the sides. And then in terms of the blur highlights, we are now getting sort of a sharper, brighter perimeter on the bokeh. You really notice that in the foreground, a little bit less so in the background. That would be a sign of an overcorrected spherical aberration. Compared to the 24, the 50 definitely has a little bit more overcorrection in terms of spherical aberration. Sort of noticing the same thing as with the 50 mil. We're getting sort of perfect concentric circles in the center of the frame, and as we get to the sides, it becomes more of a lemon shape. So it's not a ton of spherical aberration, but there is a little bit there. And I'll pull it to the foreground, and here you can really see that right in the center of the lens, we have those perfect concentric circles, and as it moves to the edge, we get more of those lemon shapes, which is the spherical aberration I'm talking about. And you can see that both in the foreground and in the background. And in terms of the blur highlights we were talking about being either overcorrected or undercorrected, this lens at least looks like they're pretty much perfectly corrected. I'm not seeing a super sharp, bright edge on any of the bokeh, nor is it getting blurry. So what I am noticing about the bokeh across the board with these lenses, again, we tested the 24, the 50, and the 105. Nothing super surprising. You get really nice concentric circles, but what I am noticing as we move to the longer focal lengths is a little bit of spherical aberration. So that's where you start to notice the bokeh warping on the sides. And in terms of looking at the blur highlights, which is another aspect of spherical aberration, I wouldn't consider these either overcorrected or undercorrected. So sort of like our flaring test, I'd say very consistent across the board. For the most part, you're gonna see the most distortion on your widest focal lengths and less distortion as the focal lengths get longer. On the 18 mil right here, I am noticing a little bit of barrel distortion. Rectangles on the focus chart, you will notice that they're sort of bending outward. So in the corners, they sort of come in, and then on the sides and on the top and the bottom, you will notice that the rectangle starts to bend outward. I don't think this is a ton of distortion, especially, again, we're on an 18mm lens on a full frame sensor. I am seeing a little bit of barrel distortion still, not as much as on the 18mm lens, but there still is a little bit there, but I don't think it's considerable. I think the only reason we're actually seeing it is because we are looking at a focus chart with these symmetrical lines. There is next to no geometric distortion with the 35. So I think it's safe to say the 50 will not have geometric distortion. On the 105, I'm not seeing any distortion whatsoever. All the lines are looking very symmetrical. Focus chart looks very rectangular. One thing I am gonna just check, if we were to throw this totally out of focus, if there is any sort of geometric distortion happening. Just looking at this focus chart, I'm not noticing anything like that. You get no distortion when it comes to geometric distortion on anything longer than a 24mm lens. Basically, we are looking for exposure fall off at the sides of the frames. Generally, a normal amount of illumination fall off would be 20%. So with most lenses, you are gonna notice 20% less exposure on the corners. We are noticing a little bit of vignetting on the 18mm. We'll see if we notice any more vignetting on the longer lenses, but my guess would be this is the most vignetting we're gonna get. I'm just shooting directly into a white board. I do now have false color up on our 17-inch monitor. So if we were getting any vignetting, we'd be seeing our strips of false color indicators starting to warm up on the corners. This is a shiny board, so there is going to be a little bit of reflection happening, which is what you see there. But now that I'm opening up, there is no loss of exposure on the corner. For resolution and contrast, the sweet spot of the lens in terms of the aperture is going to be a 5.6. So we're starting this test at a 5.6, but we'll also open the lens all the way to a 1.9 to see if there is any loss of resolution, especially on the sides. So when we're looking at the focus chart, my center bullseyes are in focus, and it's a question now if the focus wheels on the two corners are going to be just as in focus, or if they're actually going to lose a little bit of sharpness on the sides. Generally, a lens is going to get softer on the sides, but you're not going to notice that as much at a 5.6 as you are at a 1.9. We've got an ND 1.2 right now. So when we were shooting at a 5.6, we had an ND 6 on there. We've increased 2 stops of ND. But again, what we're looking for here is any sort of loss of resolution on the edges, and we're seeing if there's any sort of loss of contrast as we open up the lens. So normally with our grayscale chart, you'll see pure white and pure black on either end, so that's IRE 0 and IRE 100, but lenses have a tendency to lose a little bit of contrast as you open them up. It's looking pretty sharp across the entire image plane. So right now we are fully sharp. To the naked eye, it looks like everything is sharp across the board. Up to this point, we have talked about spherical aberration, which is essentially the breakdown of focus on the sides of the lens. But chromatic aberration is another form of aberration where there's essentially a separation of the different colors with a lens. So far, I have not noticed any chromatic aberration with these lenses. So if we're looking at the focus chart and you're looking at the bullseyes, if there was any chromatic aberration with these lenses, you'd notice a color separation in the bullseyes, but right now I'm not seeing any. To the naked eye, I'm not seeing a ton of loss in resolution, maybe the slightest amount. So I just made a slight focus correction to get that wheel completely sharp. So there is a little bit of a shift between the center of the image and the sides, but that is to be expected. So I'd say yes, we are noticing a little bit of non-uniformity in terms of focus across the 35mm lens, but only when we open all the way to a 1.9. I am noticing the smallest amount of chromatic aberration. So if you're looking at the edges of the bullseye, you will see there's like a slight blue ghosting happening. Other thing we're gonna be looking at is to see the contrast. Basically, we are just looking for as much contrast between that chip and that chip as possible. Lenses tend to get a little bit less contrasty as you open them up, but so far I haven't noticed a major lack of contrast when we've opened any of these lenses up. And our focus chart is sharp in the center, and we're going to drift over. To me, I'm not noticing any sort of chromatic aberration on the focus wheel. I'm going to just adjust the focus slightly to see if we can get it any sharper. But no, it's looking just as sharp at the same focus mark as on the center. So I would say with this lens, there is no non-uniformity in terms of sharpness across the plane. Out of the lenses that we tested, the only one that I did notice a slight Lack of uniformity was with the 35mm lens when we were wide open to a 1.9, but it was so negligible. Also, that lens was the only one that I did notice a little bit of chromatic aberration, also with a 1.9. But across the board, these lenses are looking like they have very uniform sharpness and contrast and a lack of chromatic aberration across the focal lengths.